Hey, folks, welcome to the Encuentros Latinx podcast, where we explore stories of spirituality, identity, and culture from Latinx perspectives. My name is Taylor Amaj. I'm an author and editor, and I'm Puerto Rican. Encuentros Latinx is wrapping up yet another wonderful year with Posadas Navideñas on December 15th at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, and 2 p.m. Pacific. Join us yet again on Zoom for music and fellowship. There is a very simple registration form that you can fill out and get the invite link that way. It should be a great time. Last year's service was super great, and this year's is also bound to be super great. I have neglected to clearly mention in the past on this podcast that we now have a video feed sometimes. You can find some video episodes of Encuentros Latinx and other videos of Encuentros Latinx work that isn't podcast related on the United Church of Christ YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, go find the UCC's YouTube channel and click on it, you'll see a playlist called Encuentros Latinx that has all of our stuff, all of our video stuff there. So you can go check all that out, share it around, and enjoy that content. And you might especially want to keep that in mind because there will be a video episode of today's episode, which is particularly important because my guest is sharing a video clip from his latest documentary. So you will definitely want to be able to check that out. And who is this guest? It is none other than Storm Miguel Florez, the man behind all of the editing of every Encuentros Latinx episode. He has so much to share about his experience with gender and sexuality, growing up in a time period and a culture where deviation was just not accepted. Yet he still found people who shaped him and helped him to grow into these identities that break binaries. He also tells us about his film work and all of the other creative stuff that he does. So, again, you'll absolutely want to stick around to the end and go check out the video on YouTube. He does so many amazing things, and it is fantastic to get to present him to you all in a much more fuller way. And so now, without any further delay, let's get right into our last encuentro of 2021. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Can you introduce yourself by giving us your name and pronouns?
Thanks so much, Taylor. I am Storm Miguel Florez, and my pronouns are he, him.
And we are very excited to have you on the show in particular because regular listeners will know that you are our editor for the podcast. So we definitely love to finally see your face and hear your story. So what countries do you and your family come from?
So I come from the United States. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My mom's family is from New Mexico. If you ask them, how long have we been in New Mexico? They just say we've just always been here. So there, it's a very kind of complicated in New Mexico because some people identify in a lot of different ways. Hispanic is kind of the more conservative way that people identify, and is kind of how we've identified on my mom's side over the years. But they've been there forever. They're from a county called Socorro County, which is, and then San Acacia is where my mom was born. And that's where the Pueblo Indians are kind of all throughout New Mexico and along the Rio Grande. And so, it's just it's a very shrouded history. I like to think of it as shrouded because I think at some point people had to kind of go into hiding in a way. They kind of had to try to identify as Hispanic or Spanish to not, to get along better, maybe to not be targeted in certain ways, and enslaved actually in New Mexico as well. So who knows, though, that history is very shrouded. And then on my dad's side, his family's from Mexico, and he and his other siblings were born in Roswell, New Mexico, but his parents were born in Mexico, somewhere maybe Zacatecas around there. Looking with the little bits of we can piece together, his father came to the United States in the early 1900s, and then soon after, his mom came with his older siblings, and so I think there were just three older siblings, and then the rest of them were born in the United States.
Hmm. That is definitely quite a tapestry, as so many of our folks, have. So, what is a good memory that you have of this culture, these areas that you were
Mm-hmm.
really raised in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I could talk forever about this, and so I'll try to just focus it on my dad's side, because it was always an event when we got together with my Roswell relatives, whether we were visiting them or they were visiting us. It was either because of an event, some party, or some like event like a wedding or a funeral or a graduation, and then sometimes just because someone was in town. But if someone was in town, there was going to be a big dinner, and all the cousins were going to get together, and all the aunties and uncles, and there was going to be dinner, and then afterwards, the adults were going to play poker and drink, and the kids were going to run off and do whatever we felt like doing, as long as it was somewhere on the property or at least on the street. And so those are really fun memories for me because I have a lot of cousins. Let me just say I have 57 first cousins,
Wow.
combined, my mom and dad's side, most of them on my dad's side. And so, and I'm the youngest of like all my first cousins, just about, especially on my dad's side, the absolute youngest. So all of my first cousins were a lot older than I was. So they're kind of like my aunties and uncles. They were at the adult table. So I was brought up with their kids, with my, like, I guess, second cousins. And so me and all my cousins, second cousins, would go run around and do whatever, and my brother too. And we would just get to go play. And the older cousins would take care of the younger ones and make sure that we were safe, but also like boss us around and tell us what we were going to play. And, we'd make haunted houses for each other, or we'd go play kick the can or whatever we did. But it was just like a ton of kids getting to just play at night, and do whatever we wanted. And then eventually, sometimes we'd make it back to where the adults were, over at the table where they're playing poker, and end up in somebody's lap. And, and they would always end up singing at some point late in the night. They'd always end up singing rancheras and crying and laughing. And it's just, it's just a very fond memory. It doesn't really happen anymore in my family. So it's really cherished, because that's a thing that I think a lot of us really miss and look back on. And, over time, everybody moves, everybody grows up and kind of spreads apart. So, but yeah, those are some of the most cherished memories for me.
That's awesome. I'm very focused on 57 cousins. That is my family is, I mean, it's not that big. Both of my parents each have two other siblings. And so I had a, fair amount of first cousins, but I mean, even then, it just like our family gatherings were never quite that huge. I mean, and that's just the cousins. Then you have everybody's like parent, like you just your family, I feel like could establish an entire small town.
Probably,
I mean, if I'm thinking about
Roswell.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there are well, and again, like I said, it was my mom and dad's side, but yeah, those are just my first cousins, and I grew up
Mhm.
with my second cousins, and there were a ton of them, and there's more than I can count. So I don't know how many second cousins I have, but that's who I grew up with. Like my godmother is my first cousin,
Mm,
and her oldest daughter is older than I am, and
mhm,
so like her kids are like they were like my siblings growing up.
mhm,
But yeah, it's a very large family.
mhm. So this term Latinx, the whole title of the podcast and this
Mhm.
term that has emerged in recent years, what is your experience of it? Is it a term that you really claim and embrace? Is it something that you struggle with? And, it doesn't have to necessarily be that much of a dichotomy. There can be a range for it, but because it's, such a new and evolving term, what is your your sense of that?
Sure, yeah. I don't struggle with it,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand why some people do. I understand why there's, I don't know if the word is, why there's disagreement about it. Let's say,
Mm-hmm.
I came out as trans in the early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
and at that point we were having evolving language,
Mm-hmm.
around gender and Latinx. A piece of that is around um, creating a gender degenderizing or de kind of binary
Mm-hmm.
binaryizing. I don't know if
Right,
that's
right.
really the right word, but you know what I'm saying. The very gendered language, right? And so for me, it's something that I'm very used to. When I came out, we were looking at pronouns. What are the pronouns we're going to use? Some people were using like Z and Sir pronouns,
Mm-hmm.
and we were like trying to incorporate that into our language. They them was actually being used at the time. I didn't identify as they them, even though I was gender queer at the time. But it felt for me it felt too vague. And even
Mm-hmm.
though I felt gender queer, I felt like my gender was more felt more kind of um, I don't know, more definite in some way, even
Mm-hmm.
though it was non-binary in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Gender queer is the word we used. So, he is my kind of, it's just default for lack of a better pronoun, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
But moving then to Latinx, before I saw Latinx, I saw Latin with the ampersand at the end. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that was another way of like um, making it or ah. It was kind of using
Mm-hmm.
both genders, which was a thing that I also was used to doing back in the day. When I wrote about myself, I used S/HE, and so it was like she. It was a combination of she and he,
Mm-hmm.
and so I saw Latino as that as well. So I used
Mm-hmm.
that for a while. That made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up, I was really Latino. Latina was not a word we used to
Mm-hmm.
describe ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned my mom's family maybe like more identifies this as like Hispanic, but my cousins who are younger than my cousins who were older than I was, but of a younger generation that were using Hispanic, were using Chicano.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was something I identified with. Chicano is something I always along the line identified with.
Mm-hmm.
So when Latina was being used, I was using that because it made some sense. It was a way of relating to other people and placing myself. And so I used Latinx for a while when we started using the X. That made sense. But then I realized, what? I feel more like Chicanx is more what I'm going to use.
Mm-hmm.
Chicanx. And so I used that for a while. But then I started to hear about how, like, in the spoken language, X doesn't really make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you've heard this talked about,
Mm-hmm.
and that the E makes more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Chicane, Latine.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that I really identify that with. That makes so much sense to me. And so that's where I'm at. I'm with Chicane, but that's a personal
Mm-hmm.
choice. Like, I'm really for people using Latinx, Latine,
Mm-hmm.
however feels right for them in, the ways that they identify personally and the ways that they kind of see language and feel like using language. When I was taking, I'm not fluid Spanish speaker. I've heard you talk about this. I think we have similar kind
Yeah.
of histories and
Yeah.
complications with not speaking one colonizer's language over another.
Yeah.
But I remember I was taking Spanish lessons. I was taking I had a tutor, and I was trying to learn Spanish, and she wanted me to pick my Spanish name. And so
Mm-hmm.
Storm is my first name,
Mm-hmm.
and so, tormenta is storm. That's what my name means. Like, it's more in
Mm-hmm.
alignment with a storm, with weather. Tormento, I believe, was torment.
Mm-hmm.
And so neither of those, like, I didn't want to be with an A at the end of my name,
Right.
right? And I also did not want to identify as torment.
Right.
So I said, okay, how about tormente? And I didn't
Mm-hmm.
even know at that time about the E being used to kind
Mm-hmm.
of degenderize. And the Spanish teacher, who was queer, was just like, nope, that's not a word.
Mm-hmm.
Tormenta is not a word. You can't use it. And I was like, but it's a name. We make up names all the time. It feels more right to me. It feels like a way of incorporating both aspects of the Spanish version of storm.
Mm-hmm.
And she just refused to acknowledge it. She refused to call me tormente. I felt kind of silly for suggesting it or feeling strongly about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started to hear the E, Latina, Chicana. I was like, thank you. That's what I've been trying to do
Mm-hmm.
because of my gender. And so, yeah, that's how I feel about it. I feel very comfortable with it, and I use the E more than the X, and I
Mm-hmm.
use Chicano, Chicana, Chicane more than Latina, Latino, Latina to describe myself.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's also great to hear the specificity of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, because like that is something that is very particular to like a region and experience compared to some of the other terms that we have in our larger community. I remember there was some case or other that about a year or so ago, I kept seeing these cases of like white people who were pretending to be Latinx and got caught in their grift. And there was this one person who whose grift was specifically like saying that she was Chicana and like using that such a specific term and but like using it in clearly a wrong way as one of many things that sort of indicated like this person is not actually like of the culture. Like it's one thing to like grift that, you know, pretend you're Latinx, but like you're choosing a specific like subset and you're also you know doing it wrong. I think that might have also been a case though too where it was like a professor in a university, and by assuming or pretending this identity got certain positions or certain like
Mm,
attention academically or something like that. And what the only thing that disturbed me a little bit about that story though was that apparently her friends and colleagues, I don't know how it is that they suspected that she was lying about her identity, but they suspected she was lying about her identity and then started asking like her personal friends and family and all that. And I get it, but also there are some of us who like assimilate so well into whiteness where, you know, our identity that's real could be like questioned in the same way. And so I had a moment of like thinking about that happening to me if people suddenly decided that I was faking and they started getting in touch with like my personal, you know, people in my personal life to try to like verify. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable with that idea, but at the same time, like mostly I'm just like, why are you trying so hard to pretend to be Latinx? Like it's I
yeah.
don't quite get it, but um
It's hard because, like, I feel like I relate to listening to you in the past, and you haven't used the word imposter syndrome, but
mhm.
I'm
Yeah.
that's a thing that comes to mind when
Yep.
I hear you talking about your
Yep.
experience. And I've had that experience too in my life, and
Mhm.
a lot of it's because I didn't speak Spanish. A lot of it is because when I kind of came out as queer, my immediate community when I first came out was Latina because I came out as a
Mhm.
lesbian in high school.
Mhm.
And then, but after that, the places where I was finding the things that I kind of needed and related to the most, which is around playing music and art and going, like, I ended up hanging around with people more like who were academics or like white feminists is who I was hanging
Mhm.
out with a lot,
Mhm.
who I kind of came up with. That's who kind of brought me under their wing after I came out. I worked at the feminist bookstore in Albuquerque and was part of the music festival and things like that. And so most of my community was white. And so my culture, like a lot of the music
Mhm.
I liked,
Right.
and like I just really kind of somehow just became separate in a way from my roots. I
Mhm.
remember one time saying like, who's your Latino community? And I was just like, my family, I guess.
Mhm.
And that made me, when I said that, I was like, whoa, that's intense. Like, what's that about for me? I
Mhm.
have since spent time and cultivation of of creating a close knit Latina community
Mhm.
and BIPOC community in general.
Mhm.
And there was some kind of decolonizing I had to do internally,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
I had that sense of I'm not. I would joke like, oh, I grew up white,
Mhm.
or I'm not enough, I'm not
Yep.
Latino enough, I'm not Chicano enough, I'm not whatever enough.
Mhm.
And so I get that kind of like feeling of like, should I be in this space? Should I
Mm-hmm.
be taking up the space? Should I be identifying the way that I do? And it's so upsetting to me when people uh, who don't have this experience in any way, shape, or form,
Mm-hmm.
co-opt it
Mm-hmm.
so that they can get whatever access, all that magical access we get,
Right.
that they can get the little tiny bits of resources that are available to us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for me too, like part of like it's very genuine that I declare my Latina identity pretty openly on my social media, and I do this podcast and all that kind of stuff. But also, I mean, not only is it something that where I'm much more comfortable owning this part of my identity, and so it is genuine to like put all that stuff on my profiles, but at the same time, it is also very protective against that questioning, against that imposter syndrome coming from an external source as opposed to
Mhm.
just an internal source. Especially since you don't see my Latina-ness in my name, you don't hear it in my voice, like that, like the parts of it are very invisible, and I had a very assimilated experience, and I still can navigate the world very much being assimilated unless I declare. And so it's very important for me as part of like decolonizing to be very open about it too, because otherwise that feels like erasing ancestors uh, that should be as prominent as how I'm read, when I'm
Mm.
walking down the street by
Mm.
whoever.
Mhm.
Um, I want to circle back though to the conversation about uh, Latine versus like Latinx and how that works with the language, because I think what you said is completely true about it, and I think that maybe what we'll see, especially from like a publishing perspective, is that content that is published first in Spanish will use Latine, and that seems to be like it would have an easier time getting accepted by like style guides and things like that. Um, Whereas this is actually something my day job is in educational publishing. And so I'm like working internally on a lot of DEI stuff with some of my colleagues. And that includes like the right terms for different communities and groups of people. And so when it comes right now, kind of where I am when I'm thinking about this is I'm like, okay, Spanish first publications like use Latine because that makes sense. But if it's a publication in English, then it's probably okay to use the Latinx term because that can make sense too, or use Latine. Like it's not necessarily exclusive, but I think especially for Spanish first content, that can make some more sense. And then but it is constantly evolving, and every time the conversation comes up, it's like it feels like there's some little like more nuance, and it's hard enough for anything about publishing or content development to keep up with anything, much less something like this where it's still an ongoing conversation, and there's such hostility on the internet about it sometimes, and all that stuff. The one hot take that I have about Latinx though, this is the one I don't say it a lot because people hate on the term enough, but note the pronunciation that I give for Latinx. Um, I don't say Latinx. I think that's kind of cringy sounding. And I think that saying Latinx sort of proves the point of how like awkward it is. Like we say English speakers, people that don't know Spanish at all, can still say Latino, Latina, right? When they see that. And so Latino, Latina, Latinx. It's just I don't think it's that difficult. And I think saying it Latinx just kind of proves that it's not as difficult as some of the detractors want to make it out to be. And yet this is a battle that I've already completely lost because people people are saying Latinx, and that's fine. Like I'm not gonna like come for anybody because of this, but it is a reason why I specifically say Latinx, because
Latinx.
it does have a bit of a better flow. And again, for anybody listening to this that is maybe struggling with the term at all and how say, oh well, it's so awkward to say in English, like literally listen to me say it. It's a little bit weird the first couple of times, but like you do get into a flow for it, I think.
Yeah, I've definitely heard both. Latinx does feel kind of like, yeah, I don't know if it's like emphasis on the Latin
Mm-hmm.
and this whole way that we're, oh, you're Latin, no,
Right.
not
Yeah.
Latin.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, I think there's ways. It made me think of, totally kind of off topic, but there's ways that things are spoken that I'm like, why are you saying it that way? It's not that hard to say, like, um, it's not that hard to say, like, Blanco, Texas, but people call it Blanco. It's not
Mm-hmm.
hard to say, like, out here we have, in Marin, everybody calls it San Rafael. And I'm like, where
Mm-hmm.
did the A go? Or where did that A go? So it's
Mm-hmm.
San Rafael. But like, just ways that there's just these kind of subtle ways that language gets kind of anglicized.
Mm-hmm.
That feels very confusing to me, because it's not like it's
Mm-hmm.
super difficult to,
Mm-hmm.
like, there's one thing if you can't roll your R's, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But like, you can't just put an emphasis in another, syllable, or add
Mm-hmm.
bring the letter in that's supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like when I hear this is something I try to like train out of myself too a little bit, because I'll be talking about San Juan in Puerto Rico, and I used to be like San Juan. It's like no, I can say San Juan. It's not that hard.
I got
And
that.
for that part, for that matter, I might as well be like San Antonio, San Andreas, uh, Los Angeles, like what San Diego, like what are
Right?
all the other cities?
Oh my
Um,
gosh. Yeah. I say my dad's from Mexico, but I'm from New Mexico. I went
right.
to school at Del Norte High School, but I lived off of Paseo del Norte. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this, it's so funny. It's just like, well, how's everybody saying it? Well, I guess that's just how we say it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then you told the story about your name in Spanish class too, and that reminded me of an interesting conversation I saw on Twitter several months ago, and one that I weighed in on about like the weirdness of choosing a Spanish name. And I was kind of reflecting back on my own experience with that. And I was like, on the one hand, I mean, it was fine. Like choosing a Spanish name is cool. It's something fun to do. But then on the other hand, I thought a little bit more about that. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm already Latina. Why? Like, but I had to choose a Spanish name. Like my name wasn't like enough or
Mm,
not enough.
mhm,
Like, but it wasn't what was expected to be part of it. But so it was this weird, like, was that some subtle, like, underneath
mm,
the surface, like type of erasure with that happens with like my specific intersectionalities. And it's just fascinating to think about. Like I never thought about that. This was like I took 5 years of Spanish from like seventh grade through my junior year of high school. And I never thought of it that way. Like people named Nicholas, they're like, oh, Nico, or like whatever. Like that makes
mhm.
sense. But also like, what does the Spanish name mean? Because I would then go visit my literal family in Puerto Rico who all speak Spanish, and they'd be like, Daylord. So like why is
Yeah.
and I'm like, so I was thinking about that when I saw people talking about how, because people were saying that, oh, it's really weird that that happens, because I guess apparently in other countries they don't like do that with like other with language learning
Mm,
courses, or
mm,
it was something
mhm,
like that. And then a lot of people were talking about their experiences of it, and I was like, wait a second, like I have a really weird sort of way of like entering into that too. Like my name that I was given doesn't have its own Spanish translation.
mhm.
So therefore it's not like, because I think also like Latinx kids who had typical Spanish names had teachers that were like, you have to pick a different name.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what? So,
Yeah,
man.
feels like a United States thing, because people who come here from other countries often have to from non kind of Anglo countries, have to come here and anglicize their names, whether it be their last name or their first name. And if
Mm-hmm.
they don't, well, they don't have to, but that's a really common thing, and it's really expected to be able to get by better. So it's very interesting that in our language classes, our like foreign language,
Mm-hmm.
that we're also required to do that with our names, or
Mm-hmm.
strongly
Mm-hmm.
suggested.
Yeah. So I'd love to get into your experiences with spirituality and religion and how that intersects with your identity. Because I know you have a lot of richness to that I would love to hear about.
Ooh, okay, so how much time do we have? It all started. So, I was brought up Catholic
Mm-hmm.
and baptized and had my first Holy Communion and confession and all that, those sacraments that you have. And I was really into it when I was a kid. My sister was in the chorus, and it was like a really like it was all the cool teenagers that were in this choir at 7 o'clock mass on Sunday nights, and I was there every Sunday night, just like so happy to listen to the music. And when I got into, I guess it was, I guess in eighth grade, I started going to the youth group. Only because my friend's mom made her go, and so she made me go. And my family, like even though we were Catholic and we did all the sacraments, we weren't like super religious in the sense that we went to church every Sunday. We went to church on the holy days that we had to go, but we didn't really talk about it at home. Like we went to catechism, we did all the things we were supposed to do, but we never really talked about it, and it was never really like central outside of the places we went that we were supposed to go. And so I got really involved in the church outside of my family. And so, I started going to the youth group with my friend, and I got really into it. And she volunteered me because I played music. They were looking for a new musician for the weekends of Christian living, and she was like pointing at me, and I was like, "Oh, I don't." I was like really not used to playing just by myself and in front of people. But so yeah, so one of the college youth group students or youth group participants taught me the songs and practiced with me, and so I started leading the music on the weekends. Like I was really into it. I was really involved, and that was eighth grade, ninth grade, and then ninth grade. The end of ninth grade in high school, I came out as a lesbian, and was started to have some confusion around, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for my religion? Like I really love God and I love the church, and and I grew up kind of thinking that if you sinned really badly you'd go to hell, and grew up really liking Jesus. Like I used to have like daydreams that I was a latchkey kid, so I'd always dream that he came over and we played checkers together and hang out and watch Tom and Jerry or whatever. And so like I had a strong strong
Mm-hmm.
relationship, right, to the church, to God. And then coming out understanding that like being gay is a sin was really confusing for me. And so I kind of just continued on, stayed quiet about it. I had a couple friends that knew. And then I think my 10th grade year, I had come out to my parents early my sophomore year of high school. And I've never seen my mom be so religious. Remember how I said my family wasn't religious? When I came
Mm-hmm.
out, suddenly I was like hearing her talking about God and sin and all that. I was just like,
Mm-hmm.
whoa, I never hear you talk like this. But so, I decided at a point then to come out to my deacon who led the youth group. And he was a really cool guy and got along great with the youth and knew how to relate to us. And so I came out to him. I told him I was gay, and he said, "Well, it's probably just a phase. I'm sure it's just a phase." And so around that time, they were talking to us. The older college students were having like conversations with us about sexuality, and um, you know, homosexuality came up a lot, and the answer was like, "Well, it's not a sin to be gay, but it's a sin to act on it."
Mm-hmm.
Because if you act on it, if you have sex, you're having premarital sex. You're having sex outside of marriage. And because you can't get married if you're gay, then there's no way you can actually have sex that's not a sin. And that was kind of the way, one of the ways they were explaining it, to not, I guess they did, it's very interesting. I guess it was so that they wouldn't sound super bigoted, because I'm sure all of them had queer cousins or siblings, because for some reason in Albuquerque, it was, and somebody I knew used to joke, say it was in something in the holy water, that there was there were a lot of us. There were a lot of LGBTQ. Well, let's say mostly that we know of, like lesbian and gays.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was hard to hear that, because here I was all excited about having come out, and like I was into this really vibrant community, and also hearing these messages of like I can't actually fully be who I am or else I'm sinning. And then I finally decided I was going to go to confession about it, and that was really scary for me, because confession I always did face to face. From the first time I ever confessed as a little kid on, like I would just go in and hang out with the priest and talk to them. Like, it was really comfortable. It was really just like, hey, Father Philip, confession time, great. And we would have a really like wonderful talk. And when it was time for me to come out as gay to the priest, I couldn't do it face to face.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went behind the screen, and it was one of the older priests that I had never actually talked with before. And I told him I was gay. I said, well, I'm homosexual. And he said, well, my son, now mind you, I did not identify as a boy at the time. I was still girl identified. I didn't quite understand about being trans yet. That came later. And so that really, but I was always called a boy my whole life. And it was very confusing and frustrating for me to just be kind of misgendered. This is a different story for every trans people. I just want to, for all trans people, I want to say that some trans people who are trans masculine like me will say, I've always been a boy, even when I didn't know it. Looking back, or I always knew I was, but no one would acknowledge it. So I just want to be very clear that this is my story. Very particular to me. I did identify as a girl, and I did identify as a lesbian and as a dyke. That was the language I used for myself. So when the priest said, well, my son, a lot of boys your age have these feelings. It's a phase, blah, blah, blah. I just kind of tuned out and I think I left my body at that moment. It was very scary to be in there telling him that. And then to be what at that time was misgendering me was just like, it just kind of took me out. I was kind of done at that point. Something broke. And so, and I don't fault the priest for misgendering me necessarily, but I do think it's interesting that the first thing his mind went to when I said I'm gay or I'm homosexual is that must be a boy. So I kind of just shut down in a way to the church at the time. But around that time, somebody who I was had a big crush on, who we had kind of dated and didn't work out, but I was still like madly in love with her. She was part of Young Life. Do you know what Young Life is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So, so Young Life is a group of, the best way I can describe it is high school age youth who are a Christian youth group, but also like kind of proselytize at high schools. At least they did back then. They'd always kind of try to get other kids involved. And I don't know how they got away. There were kids that didn't go to the school that were a little older that would come to our school and try to get us to go to Young Life and ask us if we believed in Jesus and all this stuff. And so, but anyway, she was a part of Young Life, and I was just always like, okay, you go do that. But then at some point she told me, I think that I'm going to stop being gay. And I was just like, what are you talking about? And she just said, I don't think Jesus wants me to act on this. Like, I don't know that I'm going to stop being gay. I can't stop my feelings, but I'm not going to act on it anymore. So I was like kind of devastated when she told me that, because I was just like all in love with her. And, but also like I was already kind of questioning the Catholic Church and what does this mean? And what does it mean to be gay? And so I decided to go to church with her, and then I decided I wasn't going to be gay. And that lasted about, I don't know, 4 months maybe. Then I went to my first women's music festival, and it was all over with. At that point, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I'm a born again lesbian. Got it. And, but, but I had kind of continued connections, touch points with Christianity. I had a friend invite me to go to her church. It was a Calvary Chapel in Albuquerque. It's very Christian, very conservative. And in this one service I was in, they slammed everyone I cared about. Like they were going off on Catholics, calling them heathens, just it was really upsetting to me. I left just being so upset. And my friend was like, I'm so glad you came. And I was like, I'm not, I'm crying. I'm angry. She's like, it's okay. I'm still glad you came. And I was just like, oh, okay. So you don't actually care about me. Like you just want to get more people in the door. And so more and more, I started just kind of getting jaded about religion. I had friends, trying to explain to me, well, if you're not saved, and if you don't choose Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you're going to go to hell. And at some point I was just like, well, then I want nothing to do with him. I want nothing to do with a God that would send me to hell for not believing in him, because God's supposed to be better than me. And I would never condemn anyone to hell, no matter what they do to me, whether they believe in me or not, or whatever. I would not do that. If I have the capacity for that, how does God not have the capacity for that? And
Mm-hmm.
so, I just got real sour about it
Mm-hmm.
all, about organized religion. And
Mm-hmm.
I was done with it. And still, my whole life, though, I'm a very spiritually inclined person. I like being in groups who do work together. I like ritual. I like ceremony. And, I feel like I've always felt like I need to find something. And eventually, I ended up in my late 20s connecting with a group of people who were doing work with Miguel Ruiz, who wrote the Four Agreements, Toltec wisdom. And I did that for like a good solid 8 years. But the very interesting thing is that most of it was white.
Hmm.
Most of Miguel's apprentices were white. So my teacher was white. It was a little, it's like, well, it's very interesting that this white woman's teaching me things that come from, where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that was weird, but the knowledge was so important for me to kind of learn and understand. And over time, after about 8 years of really intensive work with Miguel himself and all of his apprentices and the whole community, I needed to step away because it just was too white. It was so white,
Mm-hmm.
and so colonizing in a lot of ways, and so individualistic. It was so about the individual kind of enlightenment
Mm-hmm.
that I started to really feel like there was just a lot missing that I needed. I started to then kind of meet community that were really about each other and really about the good of the community and the good of humanity. And it was around the time I started to transition as well. And that was in my early 30s. And then started to get real connected to BIPOC community, really started to learn from, I worked at TGI Justice, Transgender, Gender Variant Intersex Justice Project. And they work with trans folks in prison and jails, and mostly with trans women of color, mostly Black trans women. And that's where I really started to learn about like collective liberation. And that became my spirituality in a sense. Like I was like, oh, these are the people I have faith in. When people ask me where my faith is, it is in people. It is in people who, under the worst of circumstances, are giving everything they can so that we can all be free together, um, and take care of each other and make sure that no one's left behind. And um, yeah, I think that like that ends up kind of, when I think about what is my spirituality, that's it. These days, and it has been for a while, and I still connect to old rituals. Like I still have saints up on my wall because my mom told
Mm-hmm.
me how to pray to Saint Anthony if you lose something, and
Mm-hmm.
the Virgen de Guadalupe is hanging on my door, and like there's I put up altars, and I have a crucifix hanging that
Mm-hmm.
was from when my mom died, and when my mom was dying, I was out praying a rosary because
Mm-hmm.
that was her belief. And so I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I feel very fluid, I guess, in a lot of ways. It's like, okay, this is what you believe and this is what your afterlife is. I'm going to believe that with you, but that's
Mm-hmm.
not for me. And so like trying to learn how to hold a lot of things, and that's something I guess I've been practiced at, standing between
Mm-hmm.
worlds in a
Right.
lot of ways as like a trans person or gender non-binary person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just talked a whole lot. It
Oh,
felt
that's
less like a
fine.
conversation, but
That's
yeah, it's just like
fine.
I just go on and on about this.
Yeah, no, no, that's fine. I always like to quietly take notes as I listen and then circle back on a couple of things. And you were talking about your this girl that you had a crush on who was like the leader of Young Life. And I mean, I was formed very much by white contemporary evangelical culture. So like I know what Young Life is.
Okay.
And and you were talking about this girl that you had a crush on, and she's like, so her faith is so strong, right? And she's like, Jesus doesn't want to be gay. And I immediately, I have sort of a slightly similar story in that I went to a Christian college and I didn't realize I was gay until like the summer before my senior year. So I had most of my college career just being really repressed. But then that senior year, I I had my first of like two straight girl crushes in a row, which is just a road to sadness. I do not recommend ever having crushes on straight girls. But I remember like I was really like her good friend, and we clicked right away. And I remember at one point we're like taking this really long walk around campus, and um, she's like, she turned to me at one point and she said, like very, very seriously, she's like, "Can you pray for me that I won't fall in love or get into a relationship this year? Because I really just need to focus on school." And like, in the very serious way that like young Christian kids are about having accountability partners and like praying with each other, like all that stuff. I'm like on the receiving end of this, and I'm a good Christian girl, so like yes, absolutely, because that is like what you need, but also I'm dying on the inside.
Right.
And I remember like I don't know if it was after that experience or an experience I had the next semester where I just had this very like sad but also profound realization that um to quote like love these people that I am interested in that can't or won't, return my feelings, I have to, if I'm going to love them as the image of God, right? I have to will their happiness, whether or not it involves me. And most of the time it doesn't, which is the sad part. But that is something that is sort of like a realization that I had, and something that I, on the one hand, I'm kind of forced to experience that over and over as a pattern. But on the other hand, I think that's also a good way to sort of view this type of stuff, that it is to try to think about like the happiness and the betterness of the other person, and it might not involve you being in their life or not being in their life the specific way that you want to be in their life. um and it's a really hard thing to deal with. And I mean, we could talk too about like compulsive heterosexuality, and because I mean, I have my suspicions about like, if circumstances were different and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, when somebody is expressing a need, to bulldoze over that with like, but I want, and but I'm different, and those types of things, um, usually not a good look. So um, yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's not, and at the same time, like it's not, right? Like
mhm,
respecting that is so important.
yeah.
And thinking about like that compulsive heterosexuality you're talking about,
Mhm,
thinking about how heterosexuality is crammed down our throats.
mhm,
Like really, like people say like, oh, the homosexuality, you all have to flaunt it and you have to do, and it's like, no, it's actually, that's such gaslighting, because the
yeah.
reality is the expectation to be heterosexuality is just so inherent and so
Mhm,
insidious that we
mhm,
will get completely ostracized and rejected. People will get pushed out of their churches, of their
mhm,
spiritual communities, if they're
mhm,
not heterosexual. So who's cramming
mhm.
what down whose throat?
Yeah.
And like I really get like on an individual level respecting that and
Mhm,
really wanting a person to get what they need. But on a
mhm.
systemic level, I'm just like, you know
Yeah, yeah,
what?
for real, for
Let's
real.
just, yeah, let's just be real about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, especially at a Christian college where like we had visitation rules for the dorm halls. So like guys couldn't be on girls' halls after certain times of the day, and things like that. And man, man, there are stories. I mean, anybody who went to a Christian school or who goes to one now, because not much has changed, like knows exactly what all this is about. And then and you were talking about before too, like the like that proselytizing through young life, like the white evangelical culture specifically, the way um that it will like degrade Catholicism. I remember I was at a youth retreat when I sometime in high school, and I don't remember how it came up, but we were walking back to my like cabin that my group was staying in or whatever. And maybe one of the services was about baptism, or like people were like getting baptized or whatever. And we were having a conversation about that. And I was like, oh yeah, I was baptized when I was a baby, because when I was a small child, I was baptized Catholic.
Mm,
And that Catholicism comes from my Latina side of my family. My abuela was so deeply Catholic, like to the point where I think that a big reason why feel like I resonate so deeply with traditional Christian aesthetics, like it feels like a extremely deep part of my soul, like a
mm,
maybe even farther back than my abuela, in terms of like, I don't know, like ancestors, like vibing with that kind of stuff, because it's sort of like inexplicable sometimes
mm,
how deep that seems to go. And abuela was so like very Catholic, but I remember being in this youth group situation, and I was talking about like, yeah, I was baptized when I was a baby, and this youth leader was like, no, that doesn't count, because you were a baby and you didn't make the choice for yourself. And at that time I was like, oh wow, that makes sense.
mm,
But it also was, yeah, like, I mean, man, and especially with my specific context, not only is it just invalidating to like, Catholic, but like it was also yet another thing that erased, you know, my Latina-ness, and it served
mhm,
to be another like thing that invalidated that part of myself. And I had youth leaders that would talk about like, oh well, the Catholics have these extra books in the Bible, and they're not like, and but then you look at the history of Christianity, and the Catholics came first. I mean, Eastern Orthodox came, like there was that first, there was that schism, but then like we didn't get Protestantism for another few hundred years. So,
mm.
it's just so, sometimes they're so like they like claim tradition, but they are so ahistorical in
Yeah.
their approach to theology and to how the Bible works and how it should be read and its role in worship and all these different things. And I'm like I didn't start learning about like the names for different creeds and all this kind of stuff until I went to my Christian college and had to take like academic Bible and theology courses that
Mm,
like taught me this history and these different things, because the church that I spent middle school and high school in was like, oh, we're a contemporary and we're not like that church. And so we don't do these things. And I'm like, well, you're going to detach yourself from this old tradition. You're going to claim that, you're separating yourself from that, but your theology sucks. And
mm,
so I would much rather, and I much prefer a high church aesthetic. Give me your vestments and your like, like your different colors for each of the seasons, and your candles and your stained glass and all that stuff, with your progressive, inclusive, and queer affirming theology, which is what I find in my current church that I go to, and
mm.
in many churches in the UCC. Like, give me that over, you know, PowerPoint slides and a rock band
Yeah.
that is like, oh, see, we are with the times. We are with the times, but your theology is still racist and still homophobic and still transphobic. Like, you haven't actually done the work in the substance. You've done the work in the wrapping. Um,
Hmm.
and that's like that's my TED talk about that. But
Yeah.
I have a lot of
Bring
feelings.
it.
I have a lot of feelings about that, man.
Yeah. I mean, there is so much hypocrisy in most organized religion, really,
Hmm.
that it's just like it's very frustrating because the essence gets lost, the real teachings get lost,
Hmm.
and I'm by no means a theology expert, but like just anyone who's been a part of a religious group and has critical thinking can begin to see that,
Hmm.
and see the ways that, yeah, just the hypocrisy that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I was being a little bit, exaggerating, dramatic, using rhetorical devices and things like that. Of course, you can have a traditionally aesthetic church with bad theology, and you can have a
Oh yeah.
contemporary style church that has done the work in theology. Like, it's not quite like that, even though in my personal church experience, that is the difference. What I
Yeah.
what I found, the thing that on the surface seemed to be relevant and relatable actually had harmful theology, versus the thing that seems old and outdated on the surface because of how it appears has theology that's actually alive and living and useful for myself and for others like me.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing I love about the Catholic Church too is the ceremony and the indigeneity that has like been maintained. Like so many cultures have kept their native cultures, their native ceremonies, and brought them into Catholic Church, like the saints and a lot of the just the different ways that um, that the art is. And I think about like Virgen Guadalupe and how she is brown and she's an indigenous, and just that there's these ways that cultures are going to keep pieces of their cultures in there. And I think that a lot of the I see like certain kinds of Christianity just wipe that out. Like I see like a certain like I've watched like Pentecostal um, type churches like just like wipe out all of that deep culture that that really are the indigenous parts of our cultures get just lost. And so I've seen full on Mexican Pentecostal churches, but they feel like such a white model of of doing things that it's just it's just colonized religion. It's colonial religion, I guess.
Yeah, and it makes it especially challenging and interesting to try to answer this question of what does a Latinx church look like? What does Latinx Christian worship look like? Which is a question that, I'll raise with this podcast, with a lot of the work that Encuentros Latinx does in the UCC specifically, and also more broadly, the Colectivo de UCC Latinx Ministries, also like the broader umbrella organization of all the Latinx stuff happening in the denomination. And it's a question that I ask all the time. And at first I was asking that question thinking that maybe there was sort of a simple answer, and that because I grew up so assimilated into whiteness that, it's like, oh, they're clearly, must be churches and worship settings that are, would be called Latinx, that I just need to find and kind of see what they're like. But the more that I get into this work, the more that I find that people are still trying to figure that out, especially in the UCC, which is like so predominantly white, and most of the Latinx people are sort of spread apart, where a lot of us maybe were the only one in our congregation. And so there is this like disconnection from the community that Encuentros Latinx and Colectivo they're trying to resolve and trying to find a place to gather all of that. And so on the one hand, it's like I feel a little bit better that there isn't some answer that I've just been missing out on the whole time, because that kind of tells my imposter syndrome to like calm down and go away. But on the other hand, it just makes it such a challenge, because we want to say like, oh, this is how a church can be more inclusive and welcoming of Latinx people specifically. And like, what does that even look like? Because you can't necessarily say that it's bilingual services when not every one of us speaks Spanish. You can't pinpoint a certain music style, because like it's just such a I don't know. It's hard to grasp.
Yeah, it is. It's I think about like just being in the United States or being really Christianity has, I get like we need the places where we need our spaces. We need our spaces where we can practice our beliefs, where we can practice our spirituality, our relationships with God, Spirit, Creator. And in this colonized world, that's what we've been given, right? Like we've been given Christianity. And there's a lot of other things we've been given as well, but it's big. It's in there. Like it's a big one. And that's what some of us grew up with. That's what some of us really resonate with. That is it. That's the thing. And so it's impossible to not be in a kind of colonized, whitewashed Christianity, because that is what the dominant religion is. It's no matter how it started, it is white.
Mm-hmm.
It has been um, used as a weapon by white people. It has been used as it's been used as a tool of genocide by European people. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I don't ever fault people for like, cause like, sometimes it's just like, I get like, what are the indigenous
Mm-hmm.
spiritualities and practices have been lost,
Mm-hmm.
or like I see
Right.
brown people, I see native people practicing Christianity, and I'm like, oh no, I know what that feels like. I really was into Christianity, and it was all these other barriers that took me out of it, right? It was
Mm-hmm.
all of the inevitable ways that it is brought here in whiteness that
Mm-hmm.
took me out of it. And that there are people who are like, no, but that's not going to take me out of it. I'm going to find other people like me. I'm going to find spaces where I can practice and where I can believe and where I can pray with other people. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really important.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that there's no like, I think those are things we have to create. Like I
Yeah.
see you creating it, right? With
Mm-hmm.
Encuentros Latinx and with the work you're doing, like you're creating it. And like there is no simple answer, right?
Right.
And there are churches that are very Latinx inclusive, but
Mm-hmm.
they're probably they're very conservative, right? Like
Right.
you're trying to find
Right.
like, okay, who are my progressive, queer, trans,
Mm-hmm.
um, brown people who are practicing, who I can practice with.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think that's something that we have to deal with a lot in this country, is just having
Mm-hmm.
to recreate our communities.
Mm-hmm.
Just about every group I've been involved with in some way or another, I've had to figure out a way to fit in, or
Mm-hmm.
to help create something that feels more like what I want to do. You know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
there's always these subsets. Like I started doing improv this year, and it's
Mm-hmm.
really fun. It's like giving me life, and it's to get ready for a film that I'm working on. And there's an occasional BIPOC improv group that meets, and I'm like, that's where I want to be. I want to squeeze into that
Mm-hmm.
one little spot that meets once a month, sometimes online. And it's so important for me to find people with. There's always just that I need to find the people that have the same kind of footprint that I have, or similar experiences, so that I can do this in a more natural way, and so that I can do this in a way where I can fully bring myself to it. And I think we're
Mm-hmm.
just constantly doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've had to do that in queer space. I've had to do that, like, where are my BIPOC people in queer space, and where are
Mm-hmm.
my queer people in this space? And
Right.
it's a constant endeavor, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of creation, you yourself are such a creative person. There's lots of things that you do make. And one of the reasons why I'm so happy to finally have you on the show, so that people can know what you do outside of simply editing the podcast. So can you tell us just some of the different things that you make in this world?
Sure. Um, well, I just do. I've been somehow making art my whole life. I mentioned I was the leader of the music leader of the youth group, Weekends of Christian Livings, when I was in high school. So I've been playing music even before that. Like since I was a kid, I've been writing songs. I learned how to play guitar in the 6th grade, and have just been singing and writing and playing music my whole life. I've been performing my whole life, and that was always kind of the main thing, was music. But over time, I started doing things like producing shows. I started doing some performance art. Um, I uh, have done acting and just a lot of different things, because I'm always just like, ooh, this is happening. Oh, performance opportunity. I've always felt like I had to have my hands in it somehow. And then
Mhm.
somehow, when I turned right around the time I turned 40, I got into filmmaking. That was 10 years ago.
Mhm.
And it started because I wanted to make a music video for one of my songs. But I was really interested in editing, because I'd been doing some minor editing for a job I was doing. And so I was like, well, I really want to edit. And so I went to QuackMap, which is Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project, but they are open to all trans folks. And actually, they've
Mhm.
actually opened to all BIPOC queer folks.
Mhm.
And so it's a place where you can go and learn how to make film. And I went to one of their intensive courses, and I made my music video through the course. And really just like, I was happy with how it turned out. I hired someone to film. I did crowdsource fundraising, which I've been doing since I was probably like 20 years old for music. And, out before the internet, we were just like, here, buy my 2-song tape so that I can make a 10-song CD, and always finding ways to hustle. But, so yeah, I hustled money, but I hired a camera person and a crew, and I edited the film. And I realized, I was like, yes, editing is what I love. I love to edit. So I started trying to pursue a career in editing, and that's mostly what I'm doing now. But I've also made a couple films. Well, I've made, co-produced a film, and I directed my first feature documentary that came out in 2019, and that's it's called The Whistle, and it's about lesbian youth culture in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the 70s and 80s. You've heard me talk about that, but I went back and actually interviewed a lot of folks who were around at that time. We had a whistle. I didn't mention this earlier. We had a whistle that we used to call each other's attention, that we had to that we actually had to learn. It was a rite of passage to learn this whistle. And so if I was like walking down the street and I saw in 1980, let's say, and I saw another person walking down the street that had a mullet like I did, I was like, she's family. I would whistle like that. And, she might think it's her friends, and she'd turn around, I'd give a little nod, she'd give a little nod, and then we'd continue on. Or, if I was walking along and I heard the whistle, I might turn around thinking, oh, it's my friends, because it's how we'd get each other's attention. And sometimes there'd be a whole other group of lesbians, like teenage lesbians, that give me the nod, and I get kind of shy. But it was just this way of like finding each other and identifying each other. And it was cool because not everybody heard it. It's so high pitched that people just start listening for it. But when you know the sound, anytime you hear it, you're like, who's whistling? And so anyway, that's kind of the hook of the movie. It's called The Whistle, but it's a lot about that culture that was happening at that time, and who brought the whistle, and how it came to be, and how that whole community kind of found each other and spent time together supporting each other. There's a whole section where you'll hear a repeat of a story I told about going to confession. There, I think 4 or 5 of us end up talking about our experiences in the Catholic Church. And there's just a lot of different themes that come up throughout the movie that people talk about having experience at that time. And it was very unique in Albuquerque at that. Like, it was just a very unique moment. It was not happening everywhere. And it wasn't even happening outside of that moment. Like, even after the 80s, it kind of fizzled. Like, there just wasn't as tight a community of youth anyway. So anyway, that's a film I made. It's an hour-long documentary. And now I'm working on my first feature narrative and first fiction. And it's going to be a mockumentary. Feels like a natural progression coming out of documentary filmmaking. And it's kind of a sequel to The Whistle. It's me going back to Roswell to come out to my family as trans. But in truth, they already know I'm trans and they don't care. But in the story, I'm going out to Roswell and I'm filming it. I think it's very important to film my family's responses. And I'm going out with my partner, who's also a filmmaker. And along the way, my partner starts talking about the aliens and the UFO crash landing in Roswell. And it ends up affecting where the story goes. It ends up being about something entirely than what I wanted to go out there and film. I want to go film my coming out. Turns out we're going to follow some UFO story out in Roswell. So that's the next project I'm working on, and my first fiction narrative project.
That sounds so awesome. And I mean, what a great pitch for something to look forward to. So I want to make sure that people listening know where they can follow you to keep up with this and maybe see it once it comes out. So drop your social media, website, whatever it is that people can follow you on.
For sure, yeah. So Storm Florez with the Z.com, stormflorez.com. You can find pretty much everything there. But if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Storm Miguel. That's 2 M's, StormMiguel. And same with Instagram at Storm Miguel. And I'll be posting about, I have Roswell sites up, but they're just kind of holding places right now because I'm in development, but I just wanted to hold those. And the film's going to be called Welcome to Roswell.
Very, very cool. And so one thing that I love to do on this podcast when I have musicians, writers, artists of any kind is I love to have a space at the end of the episode for them to share a piece of their work. And in this case, I have invited you you're the editor, so you splice on whatever clip from any of your work that you would like to share with us. And so give us a brief introduction of what you'll be sharing, and then, we'll go ahead and wrap things up.
Okay. So I'm going to share an excerpt or a scene from The Whistle. So The Whistle, like I said, it's about more than just the whistle. There's a whole section where we're talking about codes and words that we use to kind of like be able to talk about being gay without actually having to talk about it. And there's a section called Wrecked, and it's people talking about what the word wrecked meant. We used to use the word wrecked, and I'm not going to say more because you'll find out now what the word wrecked meant. It starts with a poem. So one of the participants, Gloria, happened to have a letter or a poem that a friend of hers wrote, and this was in the early 80s when she came out to her in high school. It might have been the late 70s. And so we had her read the poem out loud, and we animated the poem being written. And so it starts with the poem that Gloria's friend wrote, and then it goes into talking about wrecked.
This is the poem that my friend Anna wrote after I told her I was gay. And this was, of course, after she got over the initial shock of it. And so she wrote this. Do you want me to read it?
Please.
Okay. Gay Glor. There's a girl, her name is Glor. I want to understand more. She kept it hidden and hidden good. When she told me, I just stood. I do understand quite a bit, but I need ask more or I'll have a fit. It was hard for her to say a lot of things, for she is gay. I don't really care, this is a free land, for she's my friend, so I'll lend a hand. I like her for what she is, not what she does, so if I care for her, that's just 'cause. By the locker, I can't snap, for everyone is in a big rap. Tears are now flowing a bit, but not in a wrong way. For sure they're coming down, but not because you're gay. It is really weird in every which ways, for all of them call it wrecked for days.
Being wrecked to me growing up was in high school, your first kiss. Who was the first girl you kissed? Who was the first girl you were with? So it was formed as a question, well, who wrecked you?
That's the word that we used to use when we would talk about when we kissed our first girl. So that meant that we were wrecked. So when were you wrecked?
It was part of our secret code. It was part of the language that we used in order to, I guess it was to protect ourselves.
God, I haven't used that word in years. But I think back then, the biggest question was who wrecked you, or, what were the circumstances? How were you wrecked, or how did you feel about that?
Who wrecked you again?
It was Rhonda. That was my first. Who was yours?
Molly.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, same as me.
Molly wrecked a lot of girls.
Yes. Yes, that would be a very valid point. Totally own it.
Yes.
One of her sentences would always be, oh, are you Molly's sister? And Steph would say, do you like her? And if they said yes, then said, yeah, I'm her sister. It appears I wrecked a number of girls in high school, so therefore Steph would ask the cautionary question of whether or not.
So I wasn't lying.
But, God bless her record, I guess.
Yes.
Storm Miguel, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing yourself with us today.
Thank you so much, Taylor. This was so much fun. It's so cool. I get to edit. Now I get to be in it. Then I get to edit that. It's just like fully immersed experience. I'm digging it.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening to today's show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this. On behalf of Encuentros Latinx, we hope you'll join us on our next Encuentro.